Boa noite, pessoal. Então, é uma honra, né, estar aqui com a gente começando o ano com o Dilip Soman, uma das grandes referências da área aí, que gentilmente aceitou o convite, tem sido bastante parceiro aí de estar com a gente aqui hoje. Ele é diretor do BER, que é um dos centros de pesquisa e referência também na área, conduzindo muitos estudos. Tem 2 livros aí interessantíssimos que chama The Last Mile e o Behaviourally Informed Organizations, e uma das coisas muito legais é que ele dá um curso do EDX, que é Behaviour Economics in Action, então ele já deu aula para muitos brasileiros aí, tem um carinho especial pelo Brasil. Então vou passar para a Juliana para ela introduzir ele e a gente começar, mas falando que esse privilégio aí de ter ele com a gente hoje.
Okay, so now switching to English. Dilip, welcome. Welcome everyone for our first 2022 meetup, having together the Rede Bsb-EConomics and C3, a Comunidade de Ciências Comportamentais. It's a great pleasure to begin the year, and a privilege, of course, to have one of the most well-known names in applied behavioral sciences. So as most of, I would say all of us know, Dilip Soman is here.
Ju, você se mutou.
Pronto? Me ouvem?
Pronto.
Ok,
Agora
não
sim.
sei como, mas tudo bem. Então, so let's begin again. Dilip is an engineering by training. He has an MBA from the Indian Institute of Management and a PhD from the University of Chicago. He's a Canada Research Chair in Behavioral Sciences and Economics at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. He serves as the director of the university's Behavioral Economics in Action, the BEHR Research Center, and the project director of the Canadian federal government-funded partnership Behaviourally Informed Organizations. As Flávia mentioned, he's the author of The Last Mile and the Behaviourally Informed Organizations, published just last year. He also teaches a massive online course, which is known as MOOC, the BE 101X, Behavioral Economics in Action on edX. So once again, it's a great privilege to have you with us today, Dilip, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for A, the very kind introduction, and B, for having me kickstart 2022. So hopefully your meetup starts well this year, and I wish you a lot of success in all of your future meetups as well. So it's really an honor for me to be here. I was telling Flávia and Juliana and everyone else that when I first started teaching BE 101X online, this was in 2013, what was nice about teaching that course is edX used to offer sort of a little graphic showing where the students are from. And I remember for the first 3 years consistently, Brazil would be one of the top 3 places in terms of numbers of students. So it was always either some combination of United States, UK, and Brazil, or sometimes Canada came in there. Brazil had a really large number of learners, so it was always nice to see that. And in fact, when we first took that course and made it a more sort of different format, it was not synchronous anymore, it became purely asynchronous. We had a couple of people from Brazil who actually helped deliver the course as well. So again, it's a great honor, it's a great privilege for me to be here. And all of the work that you are doing is absolutely fantastic. So what I thought I would do in the next 25 minutes or so is to give you a little bit of a flavor of what we mean by behaviorally informed organizations. I'm going to do that by talking about just what it means for an organization to be behaviorally informed. I'm going to next spend about 10 minutes or so on some more recent work that we've been doing. And that work is going to show up in another book that's going to come out this May. That book is going to be called Behavioral Sciences in the Wild. So I'll give you just a little 10-minute sample of what that's going to look like. And then we'll just wrap up. I'll give you sort of a broad overview of what the future stream of work looks like. And then I'd love to get into a discussion and answer any questions. So I'm going to try and share my screen, which hopefully shouldn't be a problem. There we go. So, okay. So let me start off by talking a little bit about what I mean by the behaviorally informed organizations. And as was mentioned in the introduction, I lead a center called Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman. BI.org, the partnership that was mentioned, it's a partnership of about 25 academic researchers. These people come obviously from the University of Toronto, but from universities all across the world. We've got people in Canada from the University of British Columbia, from McGill University, from Queen's University. We've got people from the United States, UCLA, Harvard, the Wharton School, across the globe, people from London, people from Hong Kong, people from Europe. So it's truly a global partnership, and 22 organizations. And these are organizations that are for-profit. We've got consulting firms like Deloitte and PricewaterhouseCoopers. We've got insurance companies, financial services companies, a lot of different kinds of for-profit companies, a lot of governments and government units. So we obviously work with the federal government here in Canada, as well as several of our ministries and bureaus, but also the UK Nudge Unit, the Behavioral Insights team. We've been doing some projects in Mexico. We work with some of the agencies in Australia, all across the world. And the mission of this partnership is really to see how best we can embed behavioral science within organizations, right? So that's sort of the quick uptake on what it is. So I'll do that quick overview. I'll talk about what we mean by the BI.org. Then I'll get into translation and scaling, and I'm going to end up with some propositions. These are things that we as academic researchers and you as practitioners could do to make our science a lot more useful than it currently is. So let me start off with two motivating observations. The first motivating observation is born 13 years ago in this book that obviously everybody here has read, Nudge. And of course, there was Nudge, the final edition, which came out about a year ago. And the book is fascinating. It did a lot of interesting things. It made the central point that changes in context can change the outcome. So can we create context that will steer people towards the kind of outcome that we want them to engage in, right? And so in the book, Richard and Cass spoke about decisions that could improve health, wealth, and happiness in general, helping people do what they would like to do and what is good for them. And I guess the other big thing that the book did is it actually showcased the power of behavioral science, initially first to governments and then to the private sector. And of course, the private sector was already practicing some form of behavioral insights because, for example, people in marketing knew some of the tricks of the trade, but it was still not scientific. It was still based on a result. And as I'm going to argue as we go through my presentation, is sometimes just because a result or a finding or a phenomena worked for somebody else doesn't mean it's also going to work for you. So I think that's been the challenge. And so we've been pushing more and more for organizations to develop that scientific mindset. So 13 years ago, since this was passed, obviously the way I think about this is there are 4 ways in which we can change behavior. There are, the restrictions, which is essentially banning behavior, or making it difficult for people to undertake certain options. You can give them information, you can try and persuade them. People who are well steeped in the sort of classic salesmanship or marketing tradition know how this works. You can give them incentives, carrots and sticks, short-term incentives, long-term incentives, and then finally, the idea that Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein pushed the notion of choice architecture. Now, I present to you these 4 approaches, not because I want to make the claim that any one of them is better than the others. In fact, I'm not even going to suggest that that's true, right? But I do think that each one of them has its own strength. And I think we need to think about these as a portfolio. When we are trying to change people's behavior, you could think about using a combination of these approaches, or you could think about using these approaches sequentially so that overall, in the long term, you can get the most sustainable behavior change. But it's not about, choice architecture is better than incentives. I don't think that's true, right? And of course, I talk a lot about this in The Last Mile and a lot more in some of the upcoming books, but I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Since 2008, lots of examples. I mean, I could talk about hundreds of them, and that would take up all of our time. But a lot of these are fairly well known. So retirement savings. We know that a lot of people in many parts of the world need to open up retirement accounts proactively, or need to make voluntary contributions proactively to the retirement funds. What if we change the default? Instead of them having to do it and fill up forms and sign up to be a member, in the United States, research has shown that automatically enrolling people into a program will significantly increase the likelihood with which they will contribute for the retirement. Or health checkups. All of us know we should see a doctor once a year. We don't do it, right? And the reason we don't do it isn't because we're not convinced that it's a good thing, but it's a nuisance, it's a pain, there's stuff we have to do. You have to pick up the phone and book an appointment. And in one project, we just randomly assigned people an appointment, and we said, Arturo, if you can't make it on July the 16th, please give us a call and reschedule your appointment, right? So we just randomly gave Arturo an appointment. And it turns out just by having that appointment by default, increase the likelihood that Arturo would go see the doctor, right? And so there's a lot of those simple examples. Organ donation. We've seen a lot of interesting work in the domain of organ donation. Prompted choices, reminding people, asking people if they wish to donate their organs increases the likelihood that they would do it. Framing information as losses versus gains in a project here, where we were trying to get people to use energy efficient appliances, just simply saying that if you in one condition, people were told if you upgrade to an energy efficient furnace, you will save $10 in each bill. In the other condition, people were told if you fail to upgrade, you will lose $10. So it's the same information presented differently. We get fairly significant differences. Simplifying information, making information more engaging. So there's a lot of these examples, right? And we've seen a lot of these success stories. I'm going to actually go and make the point a little bit later that while all of this sounds like great news, we have to pause a little bit, right? And the reason we have to pause is that we have a lot of fantastic stories, fantastic sort of successes with betas and pilots. I don't think we've done very well with fully scaled versions, right? So a lot of these pilots have remained pilots. They have remained projects. They haven't become fully scaled. So, but that's something we'll get to in a little while. In a lot of these examples that I just shared, behavioral science or behavioral insights or behavioral economics has been treated more as a problem-solving device. I've got a problem. That problem is I've got a fantastic product, but people aren't taking it up, or people should be saving for retirement, but they're not opening accounts, so they should be seeing their doctor, but they're not doing it. So there's a problem. There's a problem, which is a gap between what people should do and what they do. And we've said, well, look, because of that, behavioral science can be used to get people to make those choices and solve the problem. And so primarily, Nudge, the book, and a lot of the work done by Nudge units is a problem-solving job, right? But there's other things we could do. So for example, can we design tools to help people make better decisions, right? And I want to give an example here of a situation where nudging might not help, right? So for example, in Canada, and I think this is true in many parts of the world, we have a national pension scheme. It's called the Canada Pension Plan. You can start withdrawing your pension at any time, age 62 upwards. Okay, so at age 62, all the way up to age 70, you can say, I want to start receiving my pension check. The longer you wait, the bigger your pension check. Okay, so here's the trade-off. Should I start receiving money sooner and receive less money, or should I wait? And this is your classic, behavioral science intertemporal trade-off kind of situation. Now, the answer to whether I should start withdrawing at age 62 or 65 or 70 isn't clear-cut. It's not clear-cut because it depends on your life expectancy. It obviously depends on your other sources of income. And this is where nudging or choice architecture has a limitation. Choice architecture works really well when the right thing to do, the correct answer, is the same for everyone. I want everyone to donate organs. Choice architecture is great. I want everyone to see their doctor. Choice architecture is fantastic. I want everyone to open pension accounts. It's great, right? But I want some people to withdraw at 62 and other people to withdraw at 70 and some others to withdraw at 65. Now it becomes tricky, right? So this is where decision-making tools can help. Now, we've already started seeing a lot of these tools in areas that range from financial decision-making or health decision-making, in business-to-business settings, tools that let companies assess the risk of a particular project. These are all things that I think we need to start investing more in from a behavioral science perspective. It's another way in which behavioral science can make a big difference. Or design. Right? I made the point in the last mile that the reason we have last mile problems is that products aren't customized, they aren't designed with a view to the kind of mistakes or the kind of decision-making processes that humans use. But if products were well designed, then in fact, we wouldn't have a last mile problem, right? And so I see a massive future taking behavioral science and combining that with the principles of design to create products that we call behaviorally informed. These are products that assume that people are human, that they may not be motivated. They assume that people will forget to make contributions to pension plans. They assume that people will be lazy and they won't phone their doctor to make an appointment. So that's another class. And then we also sort of think about a particular kind of product. We call them self-control products, situations where people should be doing something. They know they should be doing that thing, but they don't do it. Can we help them overcome that, right? And I can get into a lot of details on that. But that's the canvas of behavioral science. Unfortunately, we are still stuck in the bottom left. We are still doing choice architecture only. Well, I mean, not only. There are obviously examples of other things. But as behavioral scientists, I mean, that's the spectrum, right? Now, when you think about behavioral insights or behavioral scientists within organizations, you can start thinking about it at multiple levels, right? So obviously we said the lowest hanging fruit, if you will, is the behavioral scientist as a problem solver, right? But you could also think about a behavioral scientist as an auditor. Suppose you had a behavioral scientist or a team of behavioral scientists looking at all of your processes in organizations and trying to see, is there sludge? Is there an imperfect process that's somehow stopping people from doing what you want them to do? Is the information behaviorally informed? Is the fundamental nature of communication consistent with the way your stakeholders want to communicate? That I think would be another great contribution by behavioral scientists, right? Or we talked about behavioral scientists as designers. So it's not just auditing and finding problems, but actually proactively seeking them. And then at the highest level, we could think about the behavioral scientist as a chief strategist. It's more of a philosophical point of view. The chief strategist says and recognizes the fact that behaviors are unpredictable, but that we can actually learn about them by collecting data and by doing experiments and by keeping an eye out on what our customers are saying. And so if we start embedding that principle into everything we do as an organization, then I think we reach sort of the full potential of behavioral science. Now, let me skip this because I think the point I want to make here goes into my next slide. And I want to try and put some sort of a structure on what exactly we mean by a behaviorally informed organization. So here's a few bullet points. It understands that it's external and internal, and I emphasize internal as well. So it's not just about customers, it's about employees, it's about partners. It understands that they're human and not econs. And I think that's a really, it sounds like a very obvious thing to do, but I think most people on this call will recognize that it's a hard thing to do, and a lot of people don't understand what it means to be human as opposed to an econ. So think about privacy policies in most countries, right? I mean, all of us on this call know that if you give people a 20-page privacy policy, they're not going to read it. Yet, our consumer protection regimes, all of our organizations that help protect consumers, essentially give people more information, right? And I think that's indicative of the fact that we are not seeing them as humans, we're seeing them as econs, right? Obviously, it should know what it means to be human. So it should understand the basic principles of psychology. It should design for humans. It should be evidence-based. It should be driven by evidence. And it also knows that just having data isn't the same as having evidence, right? A colleague of mine, Mara Liederman, keeps telling me, data tells you what happens. Evidence also tells you why that thing happens, right? And so to me, a good way of thinking about data versus evidence is in an experimental sense. Do you have a treatment group and a control group? Can you compare across those two groups? Can you do a before-after comparison? Because without having that baseline to look at, we're not quite sure how to interpret data. If you have a baseline, then it becomes evidence. It believes in the test, learn, and adapt approach. Okay? Which is, it takes a product, it takes a policy, it takes a program, puts it out there, learns very quickly as to what the reaction is, what's working, what's not, adapts the product or policy, and puts it out again. And the fact that we can do this quickly will lend itself to an organization being behaviorally informed. And then it reduces sludge. It tries to be human compliant. So I keep saying this, but companies all across the world spend so much time and energy and money trying to be compliant with the law, right? Every company I know has a compliance department, right? And all of you face this, like every time you even try and send an email or prepare an ad, you've got to get the compliance department to look at it, right? I just wish we had a human compliance department. I wish there was a department which looked at every communication that came out of company or every product and said, this is consistent with human behavior. And we don't even need to spend that much on this human compliance department. Like it just requires a team of dedicated people who understand what it means to be human. So that's, in our view, what we mean by a behaviorally informed organization. Let me say a couple of things very quickly, then I'll just quickly get to translation scaling, and then we'll go to questions. So in order for all of this to work, especially the test, learn, adapt, I think there are three things that we need for success, right? The first thing, obviously, is expertise, right? If we can get into different layers of expertise, I think we need to understand human psychology. I think we need to have empathy, behavioral engineering, this notion of choice architecture, empirical sciences, all of that stuff. We need expertise in the organization. But we also need agility, right? And by that, I mean that suppose you have an organization that can learn very quickly, can it actually change quickly? Because if it can't change things quickly, then there's kind of no point learning things quickly, right? And if we start thinking about organizational cultures, like think about new product introduction, right? The common wisdom is to hold your cards to your chest. Don't share secrets, not until your product is ready for a beta test. But that may be a mistake. It may be a mistake because by the time the product gets ready for a beta test, it's perhaps too late to change it. And so I think we need to think about agility. I think we need to think about empiricism. I think we need to have a mindset that data or evidence rather than theory delivers success, right? I keep talking about Google all the time, right? All of you have probably been in meetings where you're discussing something trivially simple. Should I launch a new ad, or should I offer a discount for a product? And you know how these meetings go. There will be a bunch of people sitting around a table. People are debating the pros and cons. And I look at a company like Google, they don't do any of that. They just try it. They try the ad and they try the discount and they see what happens. And the reason they're able to do that is that their cost of experimentation is incredibly low, right? And I think this is our big challenge as we try and make organizations behaviorally informed. It is really costly in organizations to do experiments. Companies aren't built to do science. They're built to buy and sell. And I think unless we make the cost of experimentation low, we will never be able to successfully translate our science and make it widely adopted. It's a simple law of demand and supply. So let me just quickly close by talking about the road ahead, and then we can open up to questions and discussions. Three things that I think will challenge our field in the years to come. I think we are past the growth stage. I think we've grown rapidly. If you look at communities like yours, there are communities of behavioral scientists all across the world now. Every country has a group. They've got Behavioral Insights Unit. There are 225 different units as documented by the OECD, just in governments. And that's an impressive number, right? But I think we now have to go to maturity. So going from growth to maturity is a different animal. It requires us to think about the ethics of what we're doing. And I think that's going to be a nice big challenge for us. What do we mean by being ethical in the use of behavioral science? Do we have a code of conduct for the field? We don't. Right? Advertising has a code of conduct, but applied behavioral science doesn't. So I think that's one of the next big frontiers. The other one, and I've kept mentioning this word sludge throughout, think about sludge as the evil cousin of nudge. What is sludge? It's something that slows people down. It's something that makes it difficult for people to achieve what they want to do. And I think we need to start thinking about sludge and the burdens that we impose on sludge. And then the third thing, which is, I think, the big thing, the thing that's occupying a lot of my time, and it's going to be enshrined in a book that's coming out that I mentioned, is translation and scaling, right? So if you've got a result in a beta test or a pilot or in a lab experiment, is that a guarantee that that same result will translate to the field? In the book, we argue that the answer is no, right? And the answer is no, because oftentimes in the lab versus the field, you have a different target audience, your situations are different. There is what we call heterogeneity across people in the field. And the same problems hold for scaling interventions, things that work really well in the lab or in a pilot. When you try and do it nationwide, you don't get the same size of effects. And again, there are predictable reasons for why that happened. But those three, I would say, are the big challenges facing the field. There are a number of others. But at this point in time, I think I will take a pause here. And I would love to get into a discussion on either these challenges or absolutely any other questions that you have. So back to you, folks, and I would welcome all of your questions.
Thank you very much, Dilip. Let's start with Guilherme on our first round of questions. Guilherme?
Well, Dilip, well, thank you for coming. It's an honor and a pleasure, and I'll for sure share the recording of your talk with some clients and some policymakers that I have in recent contact with. I mean, just getting a little bit into the frameworks, into the concept that you talk about. I particularly I love the idea of the four different roles of the behavioral scientist. I think it's a brilliant framework and a brilliant way of illustrating the potential that behavioral science has if it goes upstream within an organization. And yet, when we will discuss examples, and even in the book, the examples that are there are more related to, I mean, nudges, choice architecture, more on the first step as a problem solver, and at the very most as a designer. Mm-hmm. So I guess my question to you, it's from your standpoint, which is a privileged one, is there out there any truly behavioral informed organizations, and if not, I mean, where would we expect them to rise?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think as an academic, the way I set myself up to answer a question like that is I make the definition of behaviorally informed organization very stringent, and then I can say with confidence that they don't exist. right? And so that's where I'll start. I'll say if I start defining at the level of every part of the organization and every process, no, it doesn't exist, right? But I do think there are some areas where we have made more progress than other areas. So financial services is an example of an industry more generally that has at least tried really hard to embrace. And I don't mean the industry as a whole. There's some good examples within the industry that has tried to embrace the principle of test, learn, adapt. So I think that would be an example. Even if you think through sort of different parts of an organization or different departments, there are some departments that have embraced this really well. Marketing has done a fantastic job. Design has started to do a fantastic job. But think about a department like HR, right? Human resources. I mean, the department name has the word human in it. And yet, over the years, we've seen HR departments become less human and more mechanical, right? And I think it's because, the same forces that pushed business to be productive and effective were the forces of standardization and metrics and measurement and dashboards. And once you start doing all of that, it becomes easy to forget that you can't simply divide human capabilities into a list of 20 attributes and measure them and be done with it, right? So I think that's where it's going to take a long time. On that question, the other thing I will also note in my interactions with companies in particular, I'm often asked, what's the strength of behavioral science? And I say the strength of behavioral science or strength of behavioral economics is that it is applicable everywhere in the company. And then I'm asked, what's the weakness? And I have the same answer. It is applicable everywhere in the company. And the reason I say it's a weakness is, as a result, nobody owns it. Right? As you know, within organizations, companies want to put things under a department, under an officer, under a unit. And so they say, well, is this going to be a marketing function? I said, well, it could be, but it doesn't have to be. Is it going to be a technology function? So I think that's been the challenge. I think companies have struggled to locate behavioral science in terms of their organizational structure. But the flip side to all of that is I don't think there's hope. I mean, I think when you start looking at industries that are data rich, for example, where it's not just the data, but the individual level data, there are multiple touch points. There is the ability to get quick feedback, and you can mass customize. Those are the kinds of industries where we will see the first behaviorally informed organization. So I expect, for example, a tech company to be the first BI org because they can do it. Their costs of experimentation are low. They can pivot quickly. And I think those are the keys to success. So long answer to a short question, but I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area.
Okay, thank you.
Artur, do you want to follow with your question, and then we'll make a round within our team, okay, and then we'll go to the audience.
Sure, thank you. Professor Dilip, thank you so much for being with us. Before I do my question, I would like to promote the book, of course. There it is, the Behavior Informed Organization. If you're either a consultant or if you're working in an organization and you want to get behavioral insights to your organization, this is highly recommended. You can buy it on Amazon. They deliver here to Brazil. So now my twofold question is about Sludge. First, I would like you to talk a little bit about this nuance on Sludge, because when we think about Sludge, we think about harming the decision making. But maybe you're harming the decision making by making something wrong easier, or difficulting something better or something good. So there's a nuance in this. So if you could talk a little bit about this, I'll appreciate it. And I would like to also ask you about the Sludge audit. There's a chapter in this book which is great about Sludge audits.
Yep.
And maybe my question is, if in your experience, do the companies, the organization, they have sludge by being inefficient, or they do it on purpose to make more money? Maybe there's a third axis on this 2x2 matrix.
Yeah. So both great questions. And while you were asking me the first question, I was actually searching on my computer files to see if I can find a little visual to share with you. So I'm actually going to share this in terms of the question about what is sludge. This, I think, gets to the point. So you're right. I think the definition of nudge versus sludge is very simplistic. I mean, it confuses what you do with what your intention is and what the outcome is, right? So you think about nudge as something that helps people by making things easy and that people deliberately do it. And I think we need to get out and sort of be a little bit more clear on what each of those things mean. So the way we think about it is that as a choice architect, as somebody who's designing a choice process, you can either facilitate a process by making things easy, or you can impede it by making things difficult. Right? And so on one dimension of this matrix, we have facilitate versus impede. Talk about facilitation versus impeding in a number of different ways. So I talk about three sources of sludge. One is it's just a complicated process, right? This has happened to me before. I fell into something called a subscription trap. Which is I was buying a book on Amazon, and somewhere there was a pre-checked box which got me a subscription to a magazine that I'm not going to name, that I didn't want to read. And so this magazine kept coming to my house, and I said, why are they sending me this magazine? And then I saw my bill, and I was actually paying for the damn thing. And so I tried to cancel it. And it turns out it was really hard to cancel. I mean, it took me several phone calls and many emails. And finally, I had to write a letter, like on paper, and mail it to New York. And then it took them like 6 months to cancel that subscription, right? So the process could be one source of sludge. The other source could be information or poor information. Right. And we've seen examples of this all over the place. There is sort of, so-called shrouded attributes, which is people don't give you all the information at the right period of time, or they give it to you, but it's really hard for you to calculate what it actually means. And sometimes they just give you too much information. And if you have so much information, people retreat. So information plays a big role in how easy or difficult facilitate impede. And then finally, emotional considerations. And I'll give you a quick example of this in some work we're doing on cash transfer programs or welfare programs. Sometimes we have welfare programs in this country and many other places where we essentially remit cash to low-income citizens. And in one particular case, we were doing this program in Asia where the person who was receiving the cash had to go to a bank, to a special desk, to collect the check. And a lot of eligible people weren't going, right? And initially we thought that was because maybe the process is complicated, and it wasn't that complicated. And we said, maybe they just don't know about it. And we started to promote it, didn't have a difference. It was because people did not want to be seen at that desk. It's a proud culture. It's a culture where I don't want to be seen as someone who requires assistance from the government to feed my children or to send them to school, right? And so sometimes our processes put the spotlight on the user. So that's another way in which we can impede decisions. So that's one dimension, right? The other dimension is whether it actually helps the consumer or hurts the consumer, right? Now you could say, isn't making things difficult always going to hurt the consumer? The answer is no, right? And think about the following example, which I always think highlights the point. Think about getting a divorce, right? So let's imagine you fight with your partner or spouse, or this could be a business situation where you don't agree with each other. You don't want a one-click button for divorce, right? There are some decisions that people make, impulsive decisions, where we want people to think more, right? It is actually good to have a friction in those decisions. So in contract in negotiations, every time you sign contract, most contract laws impose a cooling off period, right? You buy a house, you negotiate for the price of the house. There is a 30-day cooling off period in this country, and I'm sure there are equivalent laws in other places in the world, just so that if you decided afterwards that, my God, I shouldn't have offered that price, you can change your mind, right? So that's the friction. We slow things down, but it helps people, right? On the other hand, just making things easy can also be bad for people, right? So like the way in which I got that subscription, it was so easy. If it was so easy, I didn't even know I got it. And so therefore we use this 2x2, right? And we say, well, look, nudging, the stuff that Richard and Cass spoke about, well, that's facilitates decision-making and helps people, right? We can help them save for retirement. We can help them go see the doctor. We can help them eat healthy food, right? Then there are these things that we call nudge for bad or dark patterns. It's what they're called, is when you make it easy for people to buy things they don't want. And all you have to do is go to any modern e-commerce website. There'll be lots of these examples, right? Then there are these sort of decision points or cooling off periods, things where you add friction, but it helps people. And then sludge at the bottom right is the kind of stuff that we were talking about. So I think that's a handy way of thinking about sort of nudging versus sludging. It's not single dimension, it's 2 dimensions. While I'm on this point, I'm just going to say one more thing. I know it's already a long answer to your question, but I actually also think that sludge sometimes isn't deliberate. Right. So oftentimes, in Canada, the joke is every time you deal with a government office, you have to be prepared for sludge. Right. But I can tell you the government isn't trying to make life difficult for people. It just happens. It happens because people's expectations change. Or, for example, sending a letter to New York 15 years ago would not be considered sludge because that's what we did. Today it is. And if our processes don't change with our consumers or our processes don't change with our citizens, then sludge will naturally show up in our systems. And I think that's why the audit idea is important, right? Is we have to think about ways in which we can proactively track our systems to see if in fact there's a mismatch between what people think is an efficient way of getting the job done versus what is happening now. And I think and that point is important, right? Oftentimes people say, well, if a company really wants to make things difficult for people, then what's the point of a sludge audit, right? And, that's true, but I'm actually convinced, and I don't have data beyond sort of my interactions, but I'm convinced that a lot of the sludge situations we see are not by intent. They just happen, right? Like the cash transfer program, like nobody was saying, let's make people uncomfortable, right? They just didn't think about it because that's the way, cash transfers were usually done. So these were all things that sort of, as technology has changed. So simply replacing that in-person thing with a direct deposit, for example, solves this problem. Or making it easy for people to avoid conversations. So we have a similar program in Canada where the person had to take in like identity documents and they had to go to the bank and say, I'm here to collect my welfare payments. We just mail them a letter with a QR code in it. The person just goes to the desk, shows the QR code, the cashier, the teller scans it. They know exactly why the person is here for. No need for conversation. Right? So I think those are the kinds of things that we can start implementing once we do these sludge audits.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Professor Dilip, let's then turn to the audience for a while. Absolutely. And then we'll come back. So Vera Lúcia, professora Vera Lúcia, se quiser começar, você gostaria de abrir o microfone e fazer a sua pergunta?
É Vera Rita? Sou eu?
Desculpe, Vera Rita, me perdoe, sorry. So let me, and I just noticed that I was speaking Portuguese. So Professor okay. Vera Rita, please, the floor is yours for you to ask your question personally.
So Juliana, I have a confession to make. So when I was growing up in Bombay, which is, by the way, a city named by the Portuguese, I grew up next to a Portuguese church.
Wow.
So I should know how to speak at least a little bit of Portuguese, but unfortunately I don't. So sorry,
but
Professor.
You will soon, you know. Yeah, we heard that you have so many Brazilian students, so
that's true.
We'll push you for learning a little bit of Portuguese.
Perfect.
Professora Vera Rita.
Okay, thank you. Many thanks, Professor Soman. That was very stimulating. I have two quick questions, I hope. From your experience, how long do you think it would take an organization to become behaviorally informed? And also, you mentioned other methodologies other than RCT. What would they be, in your opinion, please?
Okay. So I'll start with the easier of the two questions, which is the second one, because the first one, my answer is going to be, it depends on how big the organization is and so on and so forth. I think the short version of the answer to question one is a long time. Right. And I'd say it's a longer time, the bigger the organization is, the less technologically reliant it is on shared data. I think that's where the crux comes in, and the less agile it is. So in one of our forthcoming papers, we write about this. We don't have a clear-cut answer, but we do have a model to think about how long. But let's get to the RCT question. That's an important one. So I have heard a lot of people say that if you're not doing an RCT, then you're not truly doing behavioral science. I think that's wrong. I mean, right? I think there are many situations where you can't do an RCT. And, you know, Professor Ferreira, you were there when we spoke to Richard Taylor a few months ago, where we got into a similar discussion. So we have used all kinds of methodologies. So lab experiments, I think, are actually fantastic for certain areas of policy in particular. So I'll give an example. We've been doing some work on disclosure statements, right? The fact that in the domain of financial products, every government requires banks to disclose certain information in certain formats. In Canada and the United States, it's a table format. So every time you decide to sign up for a new credit card, you see a table of information. You know, what are the fees? What is the annual rate? What are the hidden costs? All of that stuff, right? And the law basically requires banks to show that information to people before people make the purchasing decision, right? Now, we did an audit of what banks actually do, both in Canada and the US, and we learned the following. The average bank website, and I suspect this is the same in Brazil as well, I don't know, but when you go into your local bank and you say that you're interested in a credit card, the first question they will ask you on the website is, what sort of person are you? Are you a traveler, or do you like eating out? I mean, questions that are completely unrelated to the credit card. So let's imagine I say I'm a traveler. They'll say, oh, then you must be interested in frequent flyer cards. And so then it will show me 3 cards. Then it'll ask me a couple of other questions, and it'll narrow me down to 1 card. This whole process takes about 10 minutes. And then it says, oh, by the way, here's the table of information. Right? By the time I see that information, I'm psychologically already committed because I've gone through the entire process, right? I also don't have any comparison. So when the thing says that your interest rate is 19.95%, well, I don't know, is that good? Is that bad? Because I have no idea what the distribution of interest rate looks like. Same thing with the fees, same thing with all of the other terms, right? And so the law says that this has to be shown. It says nothing about when it has to be shown. Right? How do we learn the effects of that? Only by lab experiments, right? You can't do an RCT because for that you would need to change the law. And so we just put up a mock website where we can actually manipulate where we show the information. We can manipulate whether we show them one at a time or comparative, right? And that lets us learn a lot more about sort of the underlying processes and outcomes. So lab experiments for sure. The other sort of methods that we've relied on a lot are simple econometric before-after difference and difference kind of models. So to give you a quick example, we've just done a project evaluating a particular policy in South Korea. The policy was about sending text alerts every time you swipe your credit card. So every time your card is used. Now this is common everywhere in the world. But the question was, does this actually reduce spending, right? And obviously you can experiment at a nationwide level because either the policy exists or it doesn't exist. But if the policy did exist, we could look at people that had opted in to receiving the text versus people that had opted out. And we could compare those two. We can do something called propensity score matching to control for observable variables like family size and location and age and all of the other stuff. We can adjust and then we can compare the spending of those two groups, right? So I think a good backward looking before after microeconomic analysis is absolutely fantastic. Third tool, and then I'll shut up because I could go on and on, is machine learning. Right. And I think the machine learning thing is particularly important. So I made references to a project that we have been working on in Mexico to cut 5 years of work into one sentence. We learned that the most effective thing to do on average was, instead of telling people that it is important to save, to contribute to your pension because it is good for your own future, that in Mexico, it is better to say that this way you can take care of your family in the future, right? Now, obviously, on an average, this makes sense. But if you don't have a family, then this is a nonsensical message to send people, right? So for people who are single, like, why would they even respond to a message about family, right? So then the question is, who has a family and who doesn't, right? We don't know. Just by looking at the data from the National Pension Plan, we have no way of telling who has a family and who doesn't. But that's where we were able to try sending out these messages and using simple clustering techniques for machine learning to see who responded to which message, right? And we learned, for example, that in Mexico, the cutoff age was about 24 for women. So if it was 24 and above, they responded to the family message. For men, it was 26. After the fact, we looked and saw it was exactly, or not exactly, fairly similar to the average age of marriage for men and women, right? But again, like, if I was a behavioral scientist designing an RCT, I would need to come up with a priori age groups and say, well, let me do this at one age group and a different age group. And before you know it, it's a very complex experiment. Machine learning simplifies the whole thing for us. So those are three that we've used a lot of. There's obviously more things like, what we call experimentally embedded surveys. So, you could actually survey people, but instead of asking people questions like, what is your opinion about XYZ? We give them choices. Would you rather have XYZ or ABC? Just like we would do in an experiment. We've done conjoint analysis. So a lot of different techniques. But I do think our obsession with RCTs has to be tempered.
Perfect, Dilip. So I know a few people here that wanted to hear that answer. So thanks, Vera, also. Great. Perfect. Now we'll continue with the audience. I want to open to Clare. I don't know if he wants to make the question or he wants me to make it. Are you there?
Well, I can. Thank you very much, Flávia. Thank you so much, Dilip, for a wonderful talk. My question is regarding what you were talking about, the way ahead and the ethical issues. And when you have now the opportunity, as was mentioned in the Mexico case, of designing customized nudges, deploying big data and machine learning, how do you think about the ethical pros and cons of this possibility?
Yeah, so fantastic question. I think it goes back to the ethical pros and cons of using choice architecture to begin with, and I think that's where it all starts. So let me illustrate that by sort of the general principle of what makes the ethics situation for choice architecture very tricky to discuss, unlike advertising or sales promotions, right? In advertising, for example, you can imagine a world without advertising. So you can actually think about what are the ethics of advertising. We cannot imagine a world without choice architecture because absolutely every decision always has a context, right? And so when we think about the ethical challenges for the work we do, I think it's not so much whether or not we should do choice architecture, because we're always doing it and you have to do it. But I guess to what end? To what kind of behavior change we're trying to push people? So one of the principles that we've always used is to see if, in fact, there is a discrepancy between what people want to do and what they actually do. Right. So, for example, people will tell you that they want to save more for retirement and they can't do it. Or they tell you that I wish I could go to bed at 10 o'clock and wake up at 5 o'clock every day. It just doesn't happen. Right. Those are the kinds of things that I think are fair game for applications of choice architecture. Right. If you have somebody who says, I don't want to get vaccinated because I don't believe in it, then we can start questioning whether choice architecture is the right thing to do, right? I mean, it's still sort of, a matter of debate as to the collective good versus the individual good. But all I'm saying is, when you have a situation where a person says they wish they could do something, but they don't get to do it, I think that's a simple ethical situation, right? It's okay to go ahead, right? And so the spirit of your question again goes back to that distinction, right? In Mexico, we had a bunch of people saying, I would like to save more for retirement. And then we said, well, is it okay for us to then customize the messaging or customize the kind of intervention as a function of what we know about you? Right? And so we allowed people to opt in. That's how we overcame that ethics challenge, right? The problem that you're describing, though, is sort of, I call it a big tech problem, right? Where people are given interventions without their consent, right? And I think that's where it becomes a little bit tricky. So is it okay to deploy customized interventions using big data? Antonio gets a different Amazon offer than Juliana, and they don't know that they get it. It is ethically questionable. Right. And I think that's why I keep pushing for the development of an ethics charter. But I think if Juliana has said that all I care about is low prices for books, so use my information whichever way you want to get me low prices, then it's okay. Right. But I think those are the kinds of things we need to build in. So on the ethics piece, one last thing, and I'll shut up, is a lot of the research and the thinking on ethics comes from the field of philosophy, right? So all of the original writing on ethics was drawn from philosophy, right? And so that's why when you read any papers on ethics, they'll talk about these classic problems like 3 people in a boat and the boat can only hold 2 of them. So which one do you throw out? Thought experiments, right? I think we need a lot more empirical work on ethics, because to me, at the end of the day, things are ethical if people believe they're ethical. There is no absolute standard for what is ethical and what is not, especially for our field, because like I say, you can't avoid choice architecture, right? And for a field that believes in evidence, I'm actually shocked at how little evidence there is on studying ethics in behavioral science. So that's something we're trying to correct here. But I do think we need to move more towards the empirical approach, a data approach for studying ethics. So long answer to a short question, my apologies, but that's where we are.
Great. We'll change a little bit of the topic and something again that it will be very nice for you to know your opinion. While the potential and scope of BS applications is very broad, the quantity of well-trained practitioners is small, and educating, training a new one that takes time and effort. So how could we solve, you think, the challenge of scaling up the existing knowledge bases or deploy it more efficiently?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because I get asked this a lot, and I keep offering the following metaphor. So let's imagine you are in the airline business. Okay, that's a bit like saying, does everyone that work in the airline business understand how planes work? 99% of them don't, right? So I don't think everybody needs to be a behavioral scientist. But I think to the extent we can develop systems that scale, they may take the form of rule books or guidebooks or products or talking scripts or whatever it might be, right? So if you're in a call center, you just need a talking script. You don't need to understand default effect or compromise effect. You just need to know if the customer says this, say this, or here are 2 things you could offer them. So I don't see that as a huge challenge at this point in time, because at the end of the day, successful scaling eventually gets down to coming up with a process that can be replicated multiple times. But I do think it's going to be an issue going forward. I think within an organization, you don't need too many people that are behavioral scientists, but as more and more industries are now adopting behavioral science, I do think this will be a challenge. I think there's a lot of interesting initiatives worldwide at training people. So here in Canada, we're seeing certificate courses popping up. We need a standards committee. I think that's the other thing we don't have. Like anybody today can call themselves a behavioral scientist, and they don't need to show any credentials. And I think we need a credentials system. But I think the field is sort of aware of that limitation and is moving in that area. So the next few years I think will be critical. But I think we need to do this at multiple levels. So we are continuing our online courses, there will be certification courses, and I think we're going to see a lot more master's level courses as well. So I think those are the 3 fronts in which we need to think about it. Right? Can I also say, Flavia, one more thing? Is I actually don't I think when you think about business schools or policy schools, I actually think behavioral science should be taught in the context of policy and in the context of business. I don't think we need separate behavioral scientists. Right? Because in order to deploy anything successfully in an industry, you need to know the industry well. And if you get somebody that's trained only in psychology and you put them in a government, we've seen what happens, right? They'll come up with ideas that are disconnected from the realities of government, or same with development, same with business. So I do think it's really important for us to embed knowledge in the context of existing programs, as opposed to just trying to do something different.
Perfect. Totally agree. Thanks a lot, Dilip. So, Juliana?
Yeah. So Dilip, now I'm curious. So it's one question that it's out of curiosity. You didn't really mention it in your presentation today, but I've heard in other talks you mention about the SIFs, the supposedly relevant factors.
Yes.
From Taylor's misbehaving.
Correct.
And I mean, if you could share some insights, I mean, why is it really important for us to, when experimenting, when assessing the data per se, if you could just share a bit of your insights in terms of why are they relevant?
Okay, so this is a great question. And actually, I was just looking at the chat, and Jose, you have a wonderful question there. It's been a few years since we met in my office in Toronto, so good to see you again. So I'm actually going to take your question and combine it with the SIF question to talk about sort of this notion of why our science is different, right? So the first things first, I think the idea behind a SIF is that, for those of you who don't know, SIF is a supposedly irrelevant factor, right? Things that we don't predict will affect decision-making, but they do, right? And a good SIF is one that you don't expect will change things, but afterwards, when it does change and you look back at it, you can understand why. Okay, so simple fact, when you're in a store making a decision, it depends, your decision depends on whether you're alone or you have 3 children running after you, or your decision depends on whether you're, making a choice on a website on a mobile device versus on your desktop, right? Initially, I didn't think it would matter, but now that you showed me that it does matter, I can see why. So I think that's an important thing, right? Supposedly irrelevant factors should make sense after the fact, but they don't make sense before. Think about a field like physics, right? So in physics, I could ask you a simple question like, here's an object, it's a pen, right? Suppose I release the pen, what's going to happen? Okay, everybody on this call is going to predict that the pen will fall down. And they'd be right. Okay, it doesn't matter if the pen is black or blue or green. It doesn't matter if the dropper of the pen is male or female. Language doesn't matter. Ethnicity doesn't matter. Temperature doesn't matter. All these things matter in our science. Okay, the variables that conspire to produce an outcome are just larger in number. Now, I will make a note that dropping of a pen, by the way, also has some limitations, right? So the one thing you want to confirm before making a prediction is that I am on the planet Earth. Because if I were on the moon, for example, which I assure you I'm not, then you would not make the prediction that the pen would fall. Okay, and the point I want to make is that every science has a breadth of bracket, if you will, a bracket of context in which the science is valid, right? In physics, those brackets are very wide, right? Right, and then we start abstracting upwards and say, well, the phenomena of the pen falling on Earth versus the pen falling or not falling on the moon can still be reconciled by the theory of gravity, right? Our brackets are extremely narrow, right? So yes, it is a science. It's just a science that has narrow brackets, right? And I think as a result, we do the following in organizations. We are used to a particular way of consuming science, which is, you know, I speak to a lot of my friends who are in the medical profession. They'll say, well, that's an easy thing to do. You do a meta-analysis. You look for what I call empirical generalization, like you keep dropping pens, pens keep falling, right? And you say pens fall. Okay, that's an empirical generalization. And you use that fact in your organization, because if the pen falls in 100 studies, it's going to fall in Sao Paulo, right? If people react to information framing in Toronto, there's actually no guarantee that they will do it in Brasilia. Right? People are different, situation is different, right? But that's the one thing that organizations miss, right? And so what they end up doing is they will pick up a book, right, like Nudge, or they will pick up a journal like the Journal of Applied Psychology. They'll say, well, you know, Professor Taylor showed that simply by changing the framing, you could, you know, get people to buy more. Let me change my framing, and it doesn't work. Right? And then you get two kinds of reactions. One kind of reaction is sort of the scientific reaction, which you don't get a lot of, which is, well, let me try and understand why it didn't work. But the other reaction is, look, the science is wrong. Right? And I think that's what we have to worry about. We get a lot of the science is wrong kind of reaction. We saw this in COVID, right? As we got more and more information, advice changed. But that's not the way people saw it. That's, well, last time you told me wear a cloth mask. Now you're telling me don't wear a cloth mask, wear a medical mask. You guys don't know what you're talking about, right? But in one study, we found that simply telling people that the advice was going to change as we learn more makes them more receptive to the advice, right? So I think we have to sensitize practitioners and scientists to the fact that our science is different. And that's how we succeed, because otherwise we get into sort of this whole misapplication area.
Thank you very much. Mulan, I don't know if you want to,
Yes.
I mean, ask anything else, or if because your
just
question
wanted
was
to
answered,
add-
but please.
Yeah, well, thank you. Hi, Dilip. Nice to see you again.
Likewise.
It's been what, a couple of years already.
It's got to be
But,
more.
yeah,
It's been 2 years since COVID alone, so it was
yeah,
definitely much more than that.
We always compress that time, right? I mean,
That's right.
It's weird,
That's right.
but I think it's even worse than what you've explained. It's even something that works today in Toronto might not work tomorrow in Toronto.
That's correct.
And so that's so difficult. At certain times, I think that we can have behavioral scientists, but I don't know if you can have a behavioral science.
So can I build on that? I think you raise a really important point, and in the forthcoming book, I'm going to share a picture of it if I can, just so that everyone knows what it looks like. This is the book that's coming out in late April, early May. It's called Behavioral Science in the Wild, and it's co-edited by me and Nina Majar, who's now at Boston University. We make this exact point. We say, well, look, results don't translate easily, right? You can use the term fragile or whatever you want. Like the same result can vary as a function, right? And therefore, there is no substitute for what we call in situ testing in the context in which you're going to run the study. This circles back to the concept of reducing the cost of testing, right? So I think there's two things to think about. One is we have to work with organizations to make it easy for them to test in the context in which they're going to do it, right? And to Professor Ferreira's point, it doesn't have to be a trial. It could just be a confirmation, right? It could just be even a bunch of interviews to show that people are interpreting the information the same way in Brasilia as they did in Toronto. That's it. That's all we need to do, but we need to test, right? So that's one. And then second, I think we have to drive home that point to behavioral practice. Don't just go to the store and pick things off the shelf, right? So we have a cartoon in the book where we talk about sort of the nudge store. It's kind of like going to the store and saying, okay, which one of these nudges is most like my situation, right? And well, Kahneman and Tversky did that. Let me do the same thing. Nah, that's not the right thing to do. That whole notion of testing, adapting, learning, I think is key. So great point, but I think we need to do more of that in context testing.
Thank you.
Professor, we're talking about using behavior insights in organizations, of course, but most of the experience we have testing and measuring behavior insights, the results are in government nudge units. We have plenty of government nudge units publishing their results, and of course, we don't have much private sectors, companies publishing their work. So how can we access this difference, even to promote more organizations to have an in-house nudge unit?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting question that gets to a fundamental belief that people have that private enterprise is usually at the leading edge of the game and governments are slow to take up. And in this case, we've seen the opposite, right? And I think we've seen the opposite for various reasons. Incentives are one. I think governments have more of an incentive to try this stuff. I will also say this at the risk of sounding controversial, but I don't mean it in any disrespectful way. I've actually seen a lot more humility in governments than I have in private enterprise. And what I mean by that is governments genuinely don't know how things work. They don't have a mental model. A lot of governments today are just waking up to the point of being citizen-centric. So they don't have any prior notions of what it means to create value for their citizens, right? Companies do. Every company has a model. They have a way of, here's how I'm going to delight my customer, or here's how I'm going to keep them satisfied, or here's how I measure customer equity. So everybody has an incumbent model. Governments don't have it, right? And that's why governments are very open to trying things. So maybe that's one of the things that explains the difference between the two. But to the question of how do we actually help help companies start units like this is, I think, really in demonstrating the value of these units, right? So I actually spent a year in government in 2015 here, and I got one of the trickiest questions that have ever been asked of me. I was talking about the benefits of collecting data and being evidence-based, and the person said, what is the evidence that evidence-based decision-making is actually better? And the person had a good point, right? And the point was, so we actually went back and did some research on this as well, is if the environment is stable, if you're dropping pens on the earth, it's a stable environment, right? There's not much noise around it, then there isn't much value of experimenting, right? So if you're constructing something where objects may drop, like, forget it. Like, if it's going to drop, it's going to drop, right? But if the environment is unstable, lots of sifts, then I think there is value, right? And so the first thing that might be helpful for companies is to say, well, what is predictable, what is not, right? What is a stable environment and what is not a stable environment? Launching new products, always an unstable environment. We have no idea how it's going to react, right? or looking at changes in consumption patterns as a function of time, unstable environment. We don't know anything about it, right? So that's where to start, I think, would be one place. And then just doing a trial, if you will, showing that if you make a quick decision based on like the Google philosophy, let me test if a promotion is better or an ad is better, and then deploy that, I think will do the trick. And so, like, one of the companies we work with here, same exact thing. They said, well, we've always done promotions in situations like this. I said, okay, but let's just test it out and see what happens. And it turned out the promotion was not the right thing to do under that given circumstance. They tried the other option, which was couponing, and it worked well. And then the next time I said, okay, let's do couponing. I said, no, we're again going to test, because as Molan said, just because it worked 6 months ago doesn't mean it's going to work again, right? But I think once that discipline comes in, then the quote, I remember the chief marketing officer telling me, now that I'm doing these experiments, I wonder why I never did them before, right? So it is it's like any adoption. It's a slow process, but I think once, like, in Canada we call this like a hockey stick curve, right? It's slow to begin with. Once people see the value, right? So I think it's really about getting in the front door.
Yeah, thank you very much. Guilherme, you're going to do the next one?
Yes. Dilip, if you could just actually it's a blend of questions, but just getting back to a point that you addressed earlier in the presentation, that behavioral science hasn't done so well at scale, which I believe it's one of the themes, one of the threads in your current book. And if you can, with that, tell a little bit on what's on your pipeline in terms of the new book, the new developments. I guess some of us, or quite a few of us, actually were also booked and eagerly awaiting to go to Toronto back in 2020 to be hosted by you then.
Yes.
And so we wonder whether BX will ever come back again, or which format do you guys envision doing that? So you can share a little bit of the future.
Sure. So I think the behaviorally informed organizations agenda, it's going to keep us busy for a while, right? I mean, obviously we're working on a slightly progressively more challenging set of questions. I think right now we're at the stage of saying, let's go beyond choice architecture. We did that in the first book. We started introducing the idea of other things. Then we said, okay, how about translation and scaling? That's where that book that's coming out. You're going to go beyond and start asking more organizational questions, more situational questions. Things like, how do we define this notion of a noisy environment versus a stable environment, right? Because I think the environment determines which behavior change technique we should use, right? So I think thinking more broadly about complex environments where systems change with every change that you make, right? So one of the things that you'll notice about all of the research that's done in psychology and behavioral science is it's always one step in time, right? We give people two options, we change the context, we see what they choose, we show differences across groups, and we're happy, right? But life isn't like that, because in life, firstly, every person is different. They've made different choices in the past. They're going to make different choices in the future. We don't see those things. So I think we're starting to push towards our dependent measures not being one choice or one set of choices, but what happens over time, right? And that's what makes complex systems so fascinating to study. We're also doing a fair bit of work on sort of more applied areas. So there's a colleague of ours, Laurette Dubé at McGill, who's working on something called precision retailing. The idea that we can now use behavioral science and neuroscience to come up with a customized model of retailing. And I don't mean retailing as in just like going to a store, but any last mile interaction with people. And so how do we think about that customization thing? Sort of your question about ethics plays a big role there as well. We're doing work in the area of citizen welfare programs, so cash transfers. There's a book coming out. Well, it's being written right now, so it'll be a while before that comes out. And then there's actually going to be a follow-up project to the one that's coming out now. It's called What Works? And the idea is to actually document some of these points that Molan was making earlier, right? Can I take a result that's worked somewhere else? Can I try and replicate it? Can I report whether it worked or not? And then can I theorize on why it worked or why it didn't work, so that other people have now that body of evidence? So those are the various things that are going on. We're kind of doing a whole bunch of other things, which is how do people reconcile conflicting findings? This is an important practical problem for practitioners. If I read a paper showing that A causes B, and then I read a second paper showing that A does not cause B, how do I make sense of this? Right? And you can think about different ways in which people try and make sense, but unfortunately, the early research shows that people rely on the model that we don't like, which is they stop trusting the science. Okay, so how do we overcome that gap? There's things that we as scientists can do better, like the academics can do better, right? We can present our results better. We can highlight the context more. So that's just a menu of the kinds of things we've been working on. Regarding BX, I honestly don't know what we're going to do at this point in time, because when we made the decision to cancel, we sort of all thought that we'll stay home for 6 months and then we'll come back after a delay of a year. That was 2 years ago. And the world looks no different now, unfortunately. So at some point in time, it will come back. I just don't know if it's going to be this coming year. Well, actually, I know it's not going to be this year. I can confirm, unfortunately, that there will not be an in-person BX this year. There might be an online BX. We don't know.
Thank you.
I think we're done with the questions. I mean, it's been super rich. Professor Dilip, thank you so much for your time, for your insights. I mean, I'm sure everyone is a bit, understands a little bit more on how to apply behavioral sciences within organizations and make them closer to being a BI org.
Or how not to do it.
Or exactly.
Which is just don't borrow
exactly. We can't
blindly what
that.
other people did.
It's true.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for your time, for your insights. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to have you with us. But before we say goodbye, let's ask everyone to turn on their cameras so we can take a group picture, if you don't mind.
Yeah, we want to have you. Let's take a picture. It will be very nice. Register this moment. Thanks again, Dilip. It was a blast.
Thank you so much.
Let's see if anyone else.
Quem puder abrir a câmera, pessoal.
1, 2, 3 e... 1, 2, 3 e... Vamos lá. Mais uma. Acho que eu fiquei usando 1, 2, 3 e... Sorry, I forgot I was speaking Portuguese. I was going to... I think it worked. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, Dilip.
Send you the picture later, Dilip.
Thank you very much.
It was very nice to have you here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilip.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dilip. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, all.
Thank you, everybody. Obrigado pela presença, pessoal.
Obrigada, pessoal.
Por prestigiar mais uma vez. Mês que vem estamos de volta.
Obrigada.
Thanks, teacher, for the invitation.
Ai, que bom, que bom.
Para a gravação.